The anime Attack on Titan is in its final season, and with it comes a fascinating new opening sequence that is radically different from the rest of the series, in what appears to be attempts at an anti-war aesthetic. Much of the discourse, while valuable in its critique of fascism, has been limited to narrative analysis of the series. This video will go back to the very first Attack on Titan opening sequence to unpack its aesthetics, then contrast that opening to this new opening sequence of the anime. This video will then conclude with some final thoughts on what these aesthetics mean for the series. In his book, The Anime Machine, East Asian media scholar Thomas Lamarre describes two different tendencies of movement that frequently manifest in animation, in what he terms cinematism and animatism. Cinematism is an aesthetics of movement that replicates forms of cinematic realism through animation. It's frequently characterized by realistic movement into depth or a recreation of cinematic space. Lamarre describes it this way. The essence of cinematism lies in the use of mobile apparatuses of perception, which serve, one, to give the viewer a sense of standing over and above the world and thus of controlling it, and two, to collapse the distance between viewer and target in the manner of the ballistic logic of instant strike or instant hit. Animatism, by contrast, is an aesthetics of movement that is not necessarily invested in this kind of reproduction of cinematic space. It is a kind of movement in animation that often favors what Lamarre terms open compositing. Lamarre describes animatism's use of open compositing this way. Animatism favors an open compositing in which layers of the image are allowed to move more independently of one another, while open compositing tends to work against sensations of movement in depth. It makes possible other sensations of movement. Lamarre proposes the following. What if instead of aligning our vision with cinematic explorations of space, pushing forward into space like the front of a train, we looked sideways? Lamarre uses the example of looking out the side of a train as akin to the experience of animatism. Such a perspective favors lateral or sliding movement of layers as opposed to the entry into cinematic space that cinematism embraces. We see this animatism at play at the beginning of the very first Attack on Titan opening. As we watch the layers of the image move laterally, we see our main characters in dramatic poses. Contrast this to the later action sequence, where we see cinematism at play. The camera, and thus the viewer, moves like a bullet through space as we watch the action unfold. In this sequence, the enemy is trackable, viewable, and overall knowable. The Titan's monstrosity is clear. Cinematism offers a controlled view of the violence and a clear view of the strike. Many of the action sequences in Attack on Titan rely on this kind of ballistic movement into space, usually occurring during scenes of military violence. This depiction of cinematic space, these aesthetics of movement in which we as the viewer are in control, aligns then with the narrative embrace of militarism in the series. This kind of cinematic movement into space is in stark contrast to the newest opening. The opening is disorienting. Puffs of colored smoke often obscure the image, creating a flat effect. While we see aspects of animatism in the lateral moving of layers in certain sequences, we also see images of destruction that overwhelm and confound. While the first opening sequence depicted aerial shots of an army, again giving the viewer control, this opening places the camera at ground level, with the viewer seemingly at threat of being stomped by the army's march. When I watch this opening, I see images that refuse comprehension. We as the viewer do not have the sense of control that cinematism gives us. Instead, we feel like a target ourselves. None of the characters in Attack on Titan are depicted in the opening sequence, with the scant exception at the very end where we see the protagonist Eren in his Attack Titan form petrified in stone. How ominous! The lack of anime characters here goes against anime's media tradition and counters the aesthetics of previous openings as well. Anime openings feature characters for a reason. anime and its marketing is predicated on characters for their transmedia properties, what we call anime's media mix. Characters, after all, are key to generating merchandise to cross-promote the series. By not featuring characters, this goes against not only the aesthetics of the previous Attack on Titan openings, it goes against how anime markets itself, period. On the oral level, the music is challenging, with heavily distorted vocals and lyrics difficult to parse, whereas the first opening pumped you up for the action. This opening leaves the viewer unsettled and anxious. Why is there such a dramatic change of movement aesthetics in this Attack on Titan opening? Production changes, in part, perhaps explain why. Studio Wit, who made their name creating the first 3 seasons of the anime, opted to not adapt the 4th season, with Studio MAPPA taking over production in their place. With the change in studio came a change of staff to key creative roles, and perhaps a change in perspective as well. This season also starts at a remarkably different point in the series' narrative, after a time skip of 4 years. We spend the first couple episodes with mostly new characters and have a different side to the story than what we were privy to earlier. In short, the narrative has changed drastically, and it seems MAPPA is combining this dramatic narrative shift with a dramatic aesthetic shift as well. French film director François Truffaut famously questioned whether it was possible to have an anti-war film, because any film that depicts war will perhaps inevitably sanitize and glamorize it. While it remains to be seen how this latest season of Attack on Titan as a whole will treat the fascist subtext of the source material, at the very least in this enigmatic and experimental opening sequence, we're seeing a different approach to animation that I think is attempting a kind of anti-war aesthetic. Instead of the aesthetic embrace of cinematism, an aesthetic that, intentionally or not, aligns with the fascist subtext of Attack on Titan's narrative, we see imagery here that resists viewer control, that brings the viewer into the impact of destruction itself. In short, on an aesthetic level, this latest opening sequence troubles our viewership position, and attempts to undo this kind of aesthetic embrace of violence that the series is known for. I hope this video has been informative and perhaps helps us better understand, first of all, why that anime opening is kind of weird, but also the ways in which aesthetics, and particularly the aesthetics of movement, have an affective dimension and shape how we understand the meaning of a text. If you want to learn more about cinematism and animatism, the excellent YouTube channel Pause and Select has a 2-part interview with Dr. Thomas Lamarre on his work. Links in the description below for that. And finally, if you like this video, do leave a comment or like, or maybe even subscribe. Depending on how this little video experiment is received, I might end up making more stuff in the future. Thanks so much for watching, and stay safe out there.